As I mentioned earlier, Hawthorne is with the Transcendentalists. He hung out with them, but he really wasn't of them. He really wasn't a Transcendentalist. He doesn't believe in the goodness of man, the natural goodness of man. He doesn't believe in the noble savage. He doesn't believe in a whole lot of those romantic ideals. One of the things that makes him, well, let's take a look at the things that make him the first modern American writer. First, he writes in the third person rather than the first person. The Romantic writers, you remember that for the Romantics, one of the jobs of the writer was to stir up the emotions of the reader. If sensations go up, emotions go up. So the more sensations you put into a poem, the more likely they are to affect the reader. And the more you stir up the reader's emotions, the sensations, the more you're going to stir up the reader's emotions. Now the reason why you write in the first person then is because that's as close to the emotions as you get. In other words, if I tell you how I feel, it's much more effective than if I tell you how somebody else feels. So first person puts you in contact as directly as possible with the emotions of the characters, with the emotions of the story. It allows the writer to manipulate your emotions. Hawthorne stands aloof. He's the observer. When we look at Poe, you see the House of Usher, there's a first-person narrator telling us that. When you look at Poe's The Black Cat, we have a madman telling us the story. It's always a first-person narrative with Poe, who writes like a romantic to make it as intense as possible. But Hawthorne is already aloof. He's standing apart as an observer. Now, this is early realism in fiction. The Romantics had said that you describe the physical world in order to tell about the cosmic world, which is a battle between good and evil. So when the Romantics write, they write about heroes and villains. They write about evil being overcome. They write about love triumphing over death. You have the happy ending. This world is only significant as a symbolic reflection of that cosmic world, which was largely a battle of good and evil. Although you'll see the same attitude, oddly enough, in the Puritans, who were in many ways about as far from the Romantics as you can get. The realistic writers would eventually come to see themselves as scientists. The further, say 30 or 40 years after Hawthorne, realism's developed to the point, and science has developed to the point where it's really overcome religion as the main source of authority for people's ideas. And the realistic writers will say that the job of the writer is to describe the physical world as accurately as possible. In order to do that, you have to stand apart and aloof, just the way a scientist does. Does a scientist get emotionally involved in his experiments? No. You don't. The lab technician doesn't give all the little white mice names. He doesn't take them out and pet them. It's my favorite lawyer joke. Did I tell you that one? They're getting rid of all the white rats and replacing them with lawyers, because that way the lab assistants don't get attached to them. They don't get emotionally involved in either the animals or even the experiment itself. They stand aloof from it. When the people who worked on the original atomic bomb, they didn't see themselves as creating a device that would instantly annihilate, that would burn men, women, and children in a second, thousands by the tens of thousands. They were dealing with a physics problem. If you told them that's what they were doing, they would have denied it. They would say, we're trying to find out what critical number is. What does it take to get fission? That's all we're really interested in. So they didn't have any emotional, and they're not supposed to. As scientists' dictum is that you have to stand apart and aloof. And so Hawthorne is way ahead of these realistic writers, something that, even though he isn't even a transcendentalist, does make him look like a transcendental hero, and that he's standing aloof, like the writer, describing human nature. He has a distrust, and this is the way actually he's even further ahead than the realists. The realists say, as a writer, you got to stand apart and observe things. Are even a trained artist's observations infallible? No, we don't always see what's there. And everybody sees different things. We focus in on different details of an event. To some people, color attracts them and is vivid. For others, it's motion. For other people, it's light. For other people, it's individual details when things are moving around and things are happening. Sound is more important for some people. So the later realistic writers would take for granted that an observer could do that, pretty much infallibly observe. But right from the very beginning, Hawthorne is distrustful of it. And you notice that even though he's telling us the story in Young Goodman Brown, does he say that the devil's staff turned into a snake? No, he says it appeared to, it seemed to, perhaps it turned into a snake. He looks away, and Goody Cloyce and the seeming, the stick that seemed to have turned into the snake are gone. But we don't have a certainty. And of course, as you'll see when we look at Major Molyneux, the distrust, the observer as the narrator as a trustworthy observer is pretty much denied entirely by the time we get to the end of the story. So he doesn't even trust observation, which makes him a step even ahead of the later realists. His style certainly isn't sparse by our standards. But compared to a lot of the other, if you compare him to Cooper, he's a man of few words. You compare him to Hemingway, and he goes on endlessly. But compared to other contemporaries, he lessens the amount of description. And again, the reason for that is because Hawthorne is not interested in stirring up your emotions. Hawthorne wants to get at your intellect. He wants to raise questions in your mind. And one of the questions that he wants to raise the most is the one that seemed to have been almost inescapable for him, and that is, what is the nature of evil? That's another thing that the romantic writers don't do. They take evil for granted. They're illustrating good and evil. So when they put a villain in the story, you know who it is. You know who the villain is. You know who the bad guys are. Hawthorne, on the other hand, you're never sure. The good citizens of Salem, the godliest little Puritan community in America. Who are they really, if Goodman Brown is right? They're the witches. They're all witches. If you can't trust them, who can you trust? Who can you be sure of? And Hawthorne always takes that attitude of turning good and bad on its head, or creating doubts in authority. And those are modern characteristics. The 19th century lived in a much more morally certain time than we are. That's not to say that they were any more moral than we were, that they necessarily even followed the ethics and the religions that they professed, but that they felt a certainty about what they thought was good and evil. The idea of situational ethics would have been unthinkable to them. The idea that a thing might be good in one set of circumstances but might be evil in another. To them, there was an absolute good, there was an absolute evil. And they felt they had a pretty good grasp on what it was. The modern world is not like that at all. We're not really sure anymore. The number of people who can give a general definition of evil or good find that it's difficult when applying it to individual circumstances. In other words, we got a lot of gray areas. And the 19th century just didn't think they were there. But Hawthorne does. Hawthorne is always interested in moral ambiguity. You can never be sure who's right, and you certainly can't be sure just because that's who's traditionally been seen as right. The realistic approach to things. A romantic writer would normally take the existence of ghosts and the supernatural for granted. They wouldn't try to offer you any explanations for that. It was a ghost. That's what it was. Hawthorne, on the other hand, is always trying to give you alternative explanations. Did young Goodwin Brown see what he saw, or didn't he? Was the whole thing a dream, or wasn't it a dream? We never know for sure what's going on. And whenever something seemingly supernatural occurs, he always offers some sort of reasonable explanation for it. He doesn't necessarily push that reasonable explanation, but he at least offers it. And a romantic doesn't do that. A romantic just takes it for granted that there is a supernatural world. Hawthorne never tells us directly, well, who is the guy who's waiting for young Goodman Brown in the woods? He's the devil. But we surmise he's the devil. He's never actually identified as the devil. He's got a snake. He's got a stick that seems to turn into a snake, which makes him either the devil, Moses, or one of the Egyptian magi. My money's on the devil in that case. We don't know for sure. Goody Cloyce seems to identify him. When she goes by, he reaches out and touches her, and she says, "The devil." But we don't know if she's just swearing or if she's saying the devil, because she recognizes him. We're never really sure. That moral ambiguity, the fact that evil is a constant theme. In a romantic story, the theme is the triumph of good over evil. Evil appears, but it's not the focus. In Hawthorne, evil is the focus. We're always trying to find out where evil really lies. That reversal of moral expectations, which we'll see when we look more directly at the stories. We're not even sure about the moral nature of the main characters. Does Faith join the covenant or not? We don't really know. As you'll see when we look at the story, there's evidence to argue it either way. Does young Goodman Brown join or not? We don't even know about him. It doesn't look like he does because everything goes away. But as you'll see, when he comes back, there are things that make it look like he really did join. To the Puritans, just going to the witch meeting and thinking about joining would be enough to cost you your soul, to cost you your election. But we don't know for sure. We don't know the guy who sits down to help Robin in Major Molyneux. Is he a good guy or a bad guy? We never find out. We don't even know whether Robin got corrupted or he didn't get corrupted. We never know about the moral nature of people anyway, and we don't even know about the factual nature of a whole lot of things. Moral ambiguity is a 20th century phenomenon. Maybe because so many things in the 20th century looked good when they started out and turned out to be their exact opposite, that we're not sure anymore. We don't know who to trust. We don't have that kind of idealized vision of people. And this is even more true right now than it's ever been before. I mean, the worst thing that can happen to you is that you get famous as some kind of paragon of moral virtue. Because your life you will be hounded by the tabloids every moment of your life and your past life until they find at least one toe of clay, if they can't find a whole foot. The 19th century wanted to keep its heroes. They liked believing that there were people who really lived up to the ideal. The 20th century is very, very distrustful of anybody that's set up as a hero, even if they don't set themselves up as a hero. And the first thing we want to do, we like heroes, but we want to tear them down as soon as we get them. And that's a 20th century phenomenon. And that Hawthorne is really doing that with a lot of the heroes of the 19th century in both of those stories. Lack of closure. When realism finally gets fully developed as a literary movement, it will write stories that don't have an ending. And the reason for that is they're describing the real world. And to the realist, if the physical world is the real world, what happens when you die? You're dead. That's it. No explanation of what your purpose was here. No explanation of how the events of your life fit into some greater plan. You hit the tree, end of story. And so, because life ends abruptly, so should the story end abruptly. Also, as scientists, they recognize that you can't make very many broad truths. You can't really state and defend a broad truth as easily as you can a single fact, a single seeming truth. So they tend to, when you run an experiment, you don't try to test all kinds of variables at once. You try to isolate a single variable for a single group in a single set of circumstances which you control. And it's easier to defend that truth. And so he has a kind of scientific approach in that way as well. The lack of closure, again, the realistic writer tried to do what they called a slice of life. Just a photograph of a moment in time. And what they were doing from that was deriving the natural laws about human behavior. They were trying to make a scientific statement about what human nature is in a particular instance. Because of that, they limited their investigation. And so their stories just stopped right in the middle. All the romantic stories, when you get to the end of them, you get an explanation of everything there is to be explained. What happened to everybody in the story, what everything meant, all of the ambiguous parts of the story get explained for you. Because to a romantic, they're trying to tell you something. They're trying to tell you good runs the world, and it runs with a purpose. And everything is part of a plan. And so everything in the story gets explained as part of a plan. But to the realist, to the scientist, although there are natural laws at work, there is no divine plan. There's no fate. There's nothing plotting out everybody's individual lives. There's only these natural forces that impinge on us. And so you don't have the broad picture, and you don't have all the loose ends tied up. And when you get to Hawthorne, how do those stories come out? Do we know what happens? No, that's almost how you know you got Hawthorne. You get to the end, if you don't know what happened, you don't know what it meant, and you don't even know if it happened, you probably got Hawthorne. I didn't even give you the most ambiguous of Hawthorne's stories, the minister's black veil. Minister shows up, and she's sick for a while, and he shows up in church with this black veil. And he preaches a sermon on secret sin. So we don't know. Did he put this on as a kind of a visual aid that we're all wearing these black veils and hiding who we really are and our secret sins? Has he personally got a secret sin that keeps him from facing his congregation eye to eye? Or did he have smallpox and he's been disfigured? We don't know. And his girlfriend, who's he's engaged to, tries to lift the veil, and he won't let her lift the veil. And the story goes on and on, about 10 pages longer than it needs to. And he dies in the end, and you think, okay, they're going to lift up the veil. And just as he's dying, they go to lift up the veil, and he grabs their hand and tells them they can't, not to lift the veil and to bury him with it on. And they bury him with it on. And we never find out why he was wearing the veil for sure. You can guess it why, but it never gets fully explained. That kind of moral ambiguity, what did it mean? Was it good or evil? How did anything come out? Drove the 19th century nuts. You can see why Hawthorne was such a revolutionary writer when he came out. Here you got all these writers explaining everything to you. And everybody likes things explained. The 19th century likes believing that it knows what's going on, especially morally. And along comes Hawthorne, you don't know anything and you get to the end of his story. You can see why he alienated a lot of writers, why it took Hawthorne a fairly long time to get accepted. Why, in fact, Hawthorne writes a story that's kind of related to that. Young Goodman Brown is one of 13 witch stories that he wrote. And tried to sell as a book and then tried to sell separately and finally destroyed all of them. And he writes a story about a guy who writes these stories and nobody will buy them. And metaphorically, he wants to set the world on fire as a writer. So he throws them into the fireplace and watches them burn. But it's a really windy night. And the wind sucks the burning pages up out of the chimney, and they land on all the houses and set the entire town on fire. Which was kind of wish fulfillment, I think, on his part. Although when we start looking at young Goodman Brown, I think Hawthorne made some very scary discoveries about that, which might have accounted for a lot of his behavior. I think I mentioned before that if he was walking along the road and he saw somebody from town coming down the road, he would hide in the bushes rather than say hello to them. He used to sit up on this little hill by his house reading. And if people came by, and in those days when you walked down the street, you knew everybody in town by name, and you greeted them by name. And they would wave and yell up to him, and he would just look down and go around to the other side of the tree and ignore everybody. And at first it looks like what they said about him, that he was very shy at school. And that was because he had hurt his leg. His mother had overprotected him. He didn't develop a lot of social skills for about 2 years there. But when we look at young Goodman Brown, I think he really discovered a conspiracy that scared him, and for good reason. Let's take a break until 8:30, and when you come back, we'll be looking at the witches naked dancing in Paris. Oh, yeah.
It's excellent.
One of the things that's difficult about realism was that it focused on the internal struggle to make ethical decisions. But the difficulty is that a realistic writer, you can't get inside the characters, because as a scientific observer, all you can really relate is the surfaces. So the difficult task that the realists set for themselves was to use the surface details in order to get at the internal struggle that was going on to make these choices. Often because of that, you get a lot of ambiguities, because we can't really be sure what the motivations are for what a person does. For example, when we get the Robin's laughter or young Goodman Brown's paranoia when he comes back to the village. Symbolism and allegory are always things which the Romantics have done, things where ideas stood for, where characters are named for ideas. Any examples of that? Faith. I mean, he just about beats that one to death. Every time faith is mentioned, religious faith is also part of the story. The focus for Hawthorne, though, isn't the way allegory had been done in the past. For example, Pilgrim's Progress, where the main character is every man. He goes on a trip through the world, and he meets characters named Sloth and Envy and Gluttony, where they obviously stand for ideas. Hawthorne's is more to make you think about the ideas. I think Hawthorne thought he was more of an allegorist than he really was. When we look at, take a look at the young Goodman Brown first. And there's some background that make that story. Professor Callender doesn't agree with my interpretation of it. Then we disagree on the interpretation of a lot of stories. So he'll tell you that all. Actually, when Professor Callender comes in, he'll tell you, forget everything you heard the first 3 weeks. It was all nonsense anyway. Because Professor Callender is the scholar, and I'm the creative artist, so I make stuff up because I can't remember it. But I tell him I have an insight into artists that he doesn't have, so my insights are actually more accurate than his facts. But once you hear his facts, you'll probably be more convinced by him anyway. In any case, the background is Hawthorne is a kind of aloof guy, probably from a child on. A lot of people trace that aloofness to his being raised to admire his great-grand-uncle Jonathan. And great-grand-uncle Jonathan was one of the original Puritans, and you'll learn all about the Puritans when Professor Callender comes in. They had this enormously high moral standard, and they were pretty stern people. They came here for the right to be Puritans, not for freedom of religion. They didn't let anybody else practice the freedom of their religion. As that reference to, the devil says to young Goodman Brown, I was there with your father, the constable, when he whipped the Quaker woman out of Salem. Well, Jonathan Hawthorne did whip a Quaker woman through the streets of Salem for being a Quaker rather than a Puritan. He's brought up to believe that Jonathan Hawthorne is this paragon of virtue, somebody you ought to live your life trying to become. And on the death of his father, he starts to hear the whispers about the curse. His father drowned. And eventually he finds out that the curse is a curse laid on great-grand-uncle Jonathan by one of the witches that he condemned to death in the Salem witch trials in 1692. This is about 50 to 100 years after the last of the witch trials. It's been a long time since anybody believed so fervently in the physical presence of evil in the world that they believed in witches. To the Puritans, all witches were devil worshippers. Now, there are lots of witches around. Witchcraft is a religion. It's a nature religion. The vast, vast majority of all witches simply practice a religion which they trace back, in some cases, to Druid England, in other cases back to Greece and Rome, and still others believe that its roots lie all the way back in Atlantis. For the most part, though, they're basically nature worshippers. They have a goddess instead of a god. And only a tiny, 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 tiny part of witches are Satanists. Satanists are basically Christians turned inside out. They think Satan is God. God is really the one that's evil. All the rest of us are mixed up about the nature of good and evil. What we consider doing evil in the world, they consider doing good, because, and in this they have even the Satanists are like other religions. What do most religions do to God's enemies? Kill them. And so it's a laudable act to do horrible things to God's enemies. So to the Satanists, anything they do to the rest of us is actually a good thing. Now, the basic differences between the two kinds of witchcraft, both as a religion and as the practice of witchcraft as a way, by definition, witchcraft isn't, there's a fine line between witchcraft and religion, or between magic and religion. Magic is the manipulation of symbolic objects to influence supernatural forces to make changes in the physical world. And what that means basically is that prayers of thanksgiving, prayers of praise directed at any kind of deity is a religion. But as soon as you start praying to win the lottery, you've actually crossed over the line into magic, because you're manipulating symbolic objects to get a supernatural force to make changes in the physical world. So a lot of people practice magic that don't think they practice magic. So there were witches around, and there are still witches around. Most of them harmless, and very, very, very few of them Satanists, as the Puritans saw them to be. Nevertheless, the Puritans did have these trials for witches, and it starts when 3 preteen girls start to giggle in church. Now, the Puritans are unbelievably serious about what goes on in church, as they are about just about everything else. And the minister stops the sermon to admonish them, and one of the girls says, this is going to be another long, boring lecture. So the girls are now in enormous trouble. As soon as the services are over, the minister and the deacons, the lay officials of the church, bring the girls in. They want to know what's going on. And the girls say, we were bewitched. That's it, we were bewitched. Well, they want to know who bewitched you. Who are the witches? They picked somebody they knew nobody was going to defend. A black slave woman named Tituba. Now, Tituba did make some love potions and had a few sort of spells for finding out who it was you're going to marry. But she wasn't certainly wasn't a witch in fact, most of the people killed for witchcraft in Europe were mostly old women, basically the first pharmacists and some of the earliest nurses. They understood roots and herbs. They helped to cure people. When their cures didn't work, people turned on them, and they were then often burned at the stake, because their cures often worked when the religious cures of the times didn't. And in fact, you have more people probably it was over a much longer period of time, but probably more people were killed for witchcraft in Europe than were killed in the Holocaust. I mean, it's a big difference talking about 8 to 10 years and talking about 500 years or 300 years. Nevertheless, an awful lot of people were killed, and part of that was, part of the reason for many of those witchcraft accusations was that it was an easy way for a king to get rid of somebody. If you accused them of treason, you had to have documentary evidence, you had to have witnesses. If you accused them of witchcraft, that was enough to put them to the torture. If they confessed under torture, their house and their property was forfeit to the crown. So that meant that if you had a political enemy, you had the kings had a guy named the witch finder who went around looking for witches. And if you had a nice house, there's a good chance you were going to get accused. And you might think, well, what does accusation mean? Well, first he would test you. He would be looking for a devil's mark, a birthmark that didn't feel any pain and didn't bleed. And he had a thing that looked like an ice pick, and he would stick it into you. The thing was that on the side of it there was a little thing he could turn so that if he wanted it to, it would collapse into the blade. So if he wanted you to be a witch, then he would push that into your birthmark and pull it back out again, and it looked like it was going into your skin all the way and coming back out. It didn't bleed, you didn't scream. That's enough to get you sent for torture. So, and the witch finder got a percentage of everything that the crown ended up with. So if you've got a political enemy, all you do is get your witch finder to accuse him. You can put him under torture, and either he confesses and you get his property, he's penniless and he's no problem anymore, or you end up torturing him to death. One of the people accused in the Salem witch trials was tortured to death. So they put him between two doors and they piled stones on him trying to get a confession from him. He said, I never was a witch, I wouldn't be a witch, I'm not a witch. They'd put another stone on him and say, are you a witch yet? No, I'm not a witch, I never was a witch. And finally they crushed the life out of him. But that practice of even hunting witches was fairly old by the time that the Puritans in Salem set out to look for their witches. So they haul in Tituba, but they know witches travel in secret groups, in covens, 13 of them. And so they want to know who else. So they named Tituba's husband. It's New England. Pretty soon they had to start naming white people. And they started naming people that they didn't like. Now the evidence was preposterous even by the standards of the day. What happened was the girls would accuse somebody, the accused was brought in, the girls would fall down on the floor screaming, they were being tormented and tortured by devils. They'd take the accused out, the girls would stand up perfectly fine. Now, some people in the audience said, are you crazy? Can't you see they're faking? Can't you see? Girls fell down, started screaming, they're being tortured by demons. Took out the person who opened their mouth, girls stood up there fine, they went to jail too. More than 100 people went to jail. Most of them, their lives were destroyed. A couple had miscarriages while they were there. Several got sick and never got their health back. A number of families, because these were the breadwinners of the family, were put in jail. The farm went to ruin. Some of the families broke up. I think it's 19, I can forget whether it's 17 or 19, are hanged. Witches in Europe were burned. When you confessed to witchcraft, you had betrayed God. And as you see from the Puritans, you would want to make up for that. So you would want to be burned. And so confession didn't get you off, except in the Salem witch trials. Everybody who confessed to being a witch was let go. The only people who were hanged were people who insisted that they weren't witches. Partway through, after the first hanging, one of the girls wants to confess that they're making this up. And the other two said, if you do, we're going to tell everybody you're a witch, and we didn't denounce you before because we were afraid of you. And the hanging doesn't stop until one of them names the governor's wife as a witch. And you notice in Young Goodman Brown, it talks about the witch meeting, and he says, and some say even the governor's wife was there. But once the governor's wife gets accused, the governor sends in his own interrogators. They break the girls in about 15 minutes, and they admit that they made the whole thing up. Now, nobody's ever punished for that. Nobody goes to jail. None of the people falsely accused ever got anything back. About 8 years later, the governor of Massachusetts said that the whole thing had been an example of hysteria and that it was a terrible miscarriage of justice, and they were very sorry, and he ordered a day of public fasting. Well, that was all the accused ever got out of it. Now, Jonathan Hawthorne was an interrogator in the Salem witch trial. The curse that Hawthorne heard about and that they thought killed his father came from Martha Carrier, who, when she's about to be hanged, turns to Judge Hawthorne and says, "May God give you and yours blood to drink." And the Hawthornes go from being one of the most prominent families in New England all the way down to the level of poverty by the time you get to Hawthorne. And Hawthorne's family lives on the charity of his uncle. And of course, after that curse, anybody in the family who dies of anything except extreme old age, everybody attributes to the curse. I mean, Jonathan Hawthorne did die a violent death. He drowned, but he was a sea captain. They drowned with regularity. So Hawthorne, at a very young age, discovers that this hero they've set up for him is really the equivalent of a war criminal, that he put all of these innocent people to death. And if you can't trust great-grand-uncle Jonathan, who can you trust? Now, the witchcraft conspiracy itself, first of all, I'm told by some of my students, I did the literature of the occult course at the college back in 72 or 3, something like that. It was, the 60s didn't end until way into the 70s. And I have to tell you my favorite witch story, which will tell you not only how many witches there were, but how it's hard to tell who's a witch. In setting up this course, I had done some study in the occult myself anyway, and in order to get tapes and things for curriculum materials, I went out to what was called an Aquarian Age festival in what turned out to be a hotbed of witchcraft, Minneapolis, Minnesota. That's what I said. There were all kind of speakers at this. There was transcendental meditation and astrology and numerology and reincarnation and all the things that I made units in the course. And one of the lectures was on witchcraft. Now, remember, witchcraft is a nature religion. It practices magic, ceremonial magic. White magic for the most part. The difference between white and black magic is white magic generally uses sexual energy to cast a spell, and black magic uses pain. So that ideally the Satanists, supposedly their ceremony centered around torture and murder. And if you believe, this is why they're always accused as being child murderers. If you believe good is innocent and innocent is, if you believe good is bad and bad is good, innocent is bad. So what would be the best sacrifice you could make to fuel a spell? A child. Virgins are second if you could find any. It was the 60s after all. So when I went out there, they were mostly white witches, and there was a guy giving a lecture on witchcraft who, this is the 60s, but this guy was weird even for the 60s. I mean, everybody looked pretty weird then. A little beady Charlie Manson eyes, this big medallion with an upside-down 5-pointed star, leather vest and no shirt, real long ponytail, a ceremonial hatchet. And he's talking about the difficulty of recruiting for a coven and how you set a coven up and how they would pair up the people within the circle. It's practice in a circle. And he said, biggest difficulty we have in casting spells is to get all of the couples in the circle to orgasm at the same time. So that the great rush of psychic energy in the lens couple can focus it and cast a spell. There's a woman sitting across from me, looks like the classic Midwestern librarian. Very severely dressed, gray hair, little bun, American flag pin, granny glasses, puts up her hand. I figure she's going to say, "You filthy degenerate." She said, "Oh, we've solved that problem in our coven. We have the couple's orgasm sequentially counterclockwise. And that gives the psychic energy a spin and makes it easier for the lens couple to handle and cast the spell." And I said, "That lady's a witch, then the witches are everywhere." So young Goodman Brown's idea that the witches are everywhere isn't as implausible as it sounds. And he gives some hints to that in the story. I think for me, the key to the story is, you notice that, first of all, there are 3 witches named in the story. Goody Cloyce, Martha Carrier, and Goody Corey. All 3 of them are witches put to death by Jonathan Hawthorne. When he talks to the devil, and the devil talks about your grandfather, he did whip the Quaker woman out of Salem. The other grandfather was an Indian fighter and participated in a massacre when he was in his 70s. There's a lot of blood on the hands of the Hawthornes. In fact, Hawthorne himself took this curse so seriously that he added the E to the name in order to dissociate himself from his ancestors. On the one hand, the story does seem to be an allegory about a young man being corrupted. Now, I did that little digression on witchcraft from something I just remembered, and that's that generally, students have told me lately this is no longer the case. There are apparently now Republican witches. But witchcraft back in time immemorial was practiced in the nude. That's why young Goodman Brown is going to that witchcraft meeting. He isn't going there to join. Remember, he's going to go, and Faith tries to get him not to go. And he says, it's as if she knew what was going to be done tonight. No, the thought would kill her. Just this one night, and I'll cling to her skirts and follow her to heaven. Now, that's not the statement of a guy who plans to join up and give his soul to Satan. It's a guy who expects to go and see a lot of naked people. That was hard to come by. Not today, but back in Puritan times, that was hard to come by. He just wants to go and see if they really do dance around naked and have a big orgy at the end. But he doesn't plan to participate in it. I'll go. When they come and ask me to take my clothes off, I can say, "No, look, I'll sing a couple of the songs, I'll eat the cookies, but that's as far as I'm going to go." He just wants to see what's going on, and then he's going to come back and go back to his normal life. It's kind of an irresistible. And for Puritans, when you make anything forbidden, it becomes incredibly attractive to people. So he just wants to go and see if that's what they're really going to do. Now, when he goes, of course, on the one hand, it is an allegory of a young man coming of age. One of the things about growing up is that you increasingly meet evil. More and more obviously evil. And what happens to the heroes of your childhood? Do they remain heroes?
No.
No, you find out they got feet of clay. They turn out to be ordinary human beings if you're lucky. Sometimes they turn out to be a lot worse than that. How does that happen to young Goodman Brown? Look at the people he meets when he goes in there. First he meets what we assume is the devil. And the devil tells him some pretty unpalatable stuff. They're going on. Young Goodman Brown says, "I agreed to meet you, but I'm not going any further. I've come too far into the woods. No Brown has ever come this far into the woods." For the Puritans, of course, the wilderness and the woods are like the outskirts of hell. And the devil laughs at him. Says, "I was with your father when he whipped the Quaker woman. I was there at the massacre." And he says, "Well, then the deacon." And then the devil just starts to fall down laughing about that one. Because, as we eventually discovered, the deacon is the high priest of the coven. We know this because he says to Deacon Gookin, "Nothing can be done until I am on the ground." Which means the ceremonies can't start because he's the one who's going to be leading them. So he gets this, his childhood heroes are destroyed for him. Then the first person we see is Goody Cloyce. It's Goody Cloyce. Well, I can't remember anything anymore. Yes, it is Goody Cloyce. And the devil, now who was Goody Cloyce in relation to young Goodman Brown?
She teaches
She taught him his catechism, everything he knows about his faith, everything that he believes in. This is worse than finding out that his mother's a witch. Because it means that everything he knows about his faith, everything he believes has been taught to him by the handmaiden of Satan. I mean, if he believed in anybody, it had to be Goody Cloyce. So, first thing we have is Goody Cloyce is destroyed for him. Who are the next people we see? The minister and Deacon Gookin. Although I said we see, do we see them? No. He hears them. They're right next to him. He can see the bushes moving. The moon is out, but he can't see them. But he recognizes their voices. So you have the chief lay official of the church, and you have the minister are corrupted now in his sight. Well, he's still got faith to believe in. What happens there? We think faith seems to have been corrupted. When she goes over, this cloud goes overhead. And in the cloud, once the listener fancied that he could distinguish the accents of townspeople of his own, men and women, both pious and ungodly, many of whom he had met at the communion table, and had seen others riding at the tavern. The next moment, so indistinct were the sounds, he doubted whether he had heard aught but the murmur of the old forest whispering without a wind. Then came a stronger swell of those familiar tones, heard daily in the sunshine at Salem village, but never until now from a cloud at night. There was one voice of a young woman uttering lamentations. She was lamenting, but with an uncertain sorrow, and entreating, begging for some favor, which, perhaps, it would grieve her to obtain. And all the unseen multitude, both saints and sinners, seemed to encourage her forward. In the black magic covens, the initiation into the coven was to have sex with Satan and then with all members of the opposite sex. With the high priest or the high priestess, and with all the members of the opposite sex, and in some covens with all the members of the coven. It's why everybody's so anxious to get to that meeting. Goody Cloyce is walking. Her broomstick's been stolen by that unhanged witch Goody Corey. Why is she so anxious to get there? There's a goodly young man being taken into communion tonight. We've been taking in these old guys. I'm at the end of the alphabet. I'm always out of luck, but there's a healthy young man tonight. Deacon Gookin and the minister can't wait to get there. Why? There's a goodly young woman being taken into communion, into the coven tonight. So they can't wait to get there. Now, in the black magic covens, when the initiate has sex with Satan, the rest of the coven stands around and encourages them to orgasm. Because if they surrender physically, then that is symbolic of their spiritual surrender, and their surrender is complete. So you have their souls completely. That's what's going on in the cloud. That's what all those noises are, and everybody and she's begging for something that if she gets it, she'll be sorry. So it's really faith being initiated already. And young Goodman knows. How does he know it's faith? The pink ribbons, which is the only thing we know about what she looks like, comes floating down. And when he finds him, this is when he turns it back into an allegory. Faith, shouted Goodman Brown in a voice of agony and desperation. And echoes of the forest mocked him, crying, "Faith, faith," as if bewildered wretches were seeking her all through the wilderness. The cry of grief, rage, and terror was yet piercing the night when the unhappy husband held his breath for a response. There was a scream, drowned immediately in a loud murmur of voices fading into far-off laughter as the dark clouds swept away, leaving clear and silent the sky above Goodman Brown. Something fluttered lightly down through the air and caught on the branch of a tree. The young man seized it and beheld a pink ribbon. "My faith is gone," he cried. So now he hasn't even got faith to believe in anymore. And he cries, when he cries out, it sounds like there are these wretches who have lost their faith everywhere, running through the forest. Then he loses faith in himself. He doesn't believe in anything anymore. So nothing fears, nothing frightens him. Ha ha ha, roared Goodman Brown when the wind laughed at him. Let us hear which will laugh the loudest. Think not to frighten me with your deviltry. Come witch, come wizard, come Indian powwow, come devil himself, and here comes Goodman Brown. You may as well fear him as he fear you. And Hawthorne tells us the fiend in his own shape is less hideous than when he rages in the breast of a man. So even Goodman Brown at that point seems to have been corrupted. When he gets to the witch meeting, who does he see there? Or seem to see? His mother and his father. The ghost of his mother and father. His mother can't look at him. Why not? She used to be a witch. And what's his father doing? Beckoning him in to join. He goes into the witch meeting, and what seems to be the devil tells them that anybody who joins will get a knowledge of the secret sin of others greater than the knowledge of their own sin. Just as they're about to join, he says to Faith, 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 look up to heaven and resist the wicked one. And what happened? All of a sudden it's morning. The trees that seem to be on fire aren't on fire anymore. Faith isn't there. Nobody's there. Doesn't even seem like there was anything ever there. When he goes back to town, the first thing he does is he runs into the people that he thought are witches. And he grabs the little child away from Goody Cloyce. And when he goes to church on Sunday, he keeps waiting for God to strike them all with lightning because the minister's a witch. How about faith? Because this is one of the big questions to get on that's unanswered. It's whether faith joins or she doesn't join. Well, you might say she doesn't join because she's not there with him. She disappears with everybody else. In terms of magic, that's what should have happened. How does young Goodman Brown get to the witch meeting? Yeah, he walks there on the ground through the physical world. How does Faith get there? She comes in the cloud, the Coven bus. She comes by magic. If she renounces the magic, the spell is broken. She shouldn't be there in the woods. She should be at home. That seems to indicate that she did renounce, look up to heaven and resist the wicked one. Another thing in favor of her having renounced the magic is that when we look at her ribbons, Puritans, as you see, didn't decorate themselves very much. If they did, what color would their ribbons have been? White for purity. Hawthorne, remember, writes the Scarlet Letter. What does scarlet stand for? A sin, adultery, specifically, sex. So in other words, if Faith were completely pure, her ribbons would be white. If, when she comes back from the Coven meeting, having slept with everybody at the Coven, what color should her ribbons be? They should be red. What color are they? They're still pink. They're pink because she's been married for 3 months. So she has some knowledge of sex, but it's not all the way over into lust and adultery. So we'd expect the ribbons to be red. Instead, they're pink. However, on the side of arguing that she joined is her response when Goodman Brown comes in. What does she do? She runs up and kisses him. Puritans didn't do that. For married couples, that was 3 days in the stocks to kiss your husband in public. This is pretty wanton behavior for a young Puritan wife. That makes it look like she did join. Then we have another problem, and that's the very last part of the story. And when he had lived long, and was borne to his grave a hoary corpse, followed by Faith, an aged woman, and children and grandchildren, a goodly procession, beside neighbors not a few, they carved no hopeful verse upon his tombstone, for his dying hour was gloom. The verse they should have carved was, "Here lies young Goodman Brown in hopes of the resurrection." But as you'll see when you do the Puritans, the only person who really knows the state of your soul other than God is you yourself. If you're doubtful about your resurrection, then you're probably right. So in other words, if they're Puritans, they might not have carved the verse, because instead of dying thinking he was going on happily to heaven, young Goodman Brown died just the opposite, apparently thinking he was going to hell. However, these people that bury him, who does young Goodman Brown think these people are? The witches. Why wouldn't the witches carve, "Here lies young Goodman Brown in hopes of the resurrection"? He's not one of them. They don't think the Puritans are coming back. If anybody gets a resurrection, it's going to be them. Children and grandchildren, not a few. There's a problem. Young Goodman Brown thinks his wife's a witch. Remember when she kisses him, he pushes her away. Well, what will happen if he ever sleeps with her? He'll be a witch. He might as well have joined in the... You know this is a witch, the enemies of God, a follower of Satan, and you sleep with them, you've as good as joined the coven. So if Goodman Brown ever slept with Faith, which we don't know if he did or not, then he's right to believe that he's damned when he goes into the grave. And if he didn't sleep with Faith, where did the children and grandchildren come from? They could have come from the coven. If she was right and she really did join the coven, then they're the coven's children. But we don't know. We don't know whether she joined or she didn't join. We don't know if young Goodman Brown joined or if he didn't join. We don't know the nature of evil. Notice, remember, the first thing he does is stand evil on its head. We think that the Puritans would have been the good guys. In any other story told in those days, the Puritans would have been the good guys. But instead, in this, the Puritans are actually the witches. If he's right that they are the witches, and he knows about them, why don't they kill him? I mean, the witches, the devil worshippers have to stay secret. The Puritans hanged them. How come they're not worried about him knowing? One, who's he going to tell? Even before that, maybe he already joined, so they're not worried about it. Maybe he slept with Faith, so they're not worried about it. And the other thing is, who can he tell? If Salem, the most godly little town in America, is shot through with Satanists, where could you possibly go and be sure you weren't talking to a witch? And who would believe you anyway? You go to another town, oh, there are witches in the town. Who are they? The minister, Deacon Gookin, Goody Cloyce, who taught me my catechism. Yeah, right. And of course, you always have the problem of whoever you're telling, whatever authority, saying, really? We didn't know that. Never mind. So they don't have to kill him. Now, you have again that allegory of good being exposed to increasing evil. We have the questionable moral nature of evil. We don't know whether the Puritans are the good guys or the bad guys. It seems to be turned upside down. We don't know for sure whether young Goodman Brown was right about them. I mean, he said he thinks they're witches. But that doesn't mean they really were. Hawthorne gives us an alternative. What is it? Did young Goodman Brown dream the dream of a witch meeting? Be it so, if you will. It was a dream of evil omen because it destroyed the rest of his life. We don't know. All of a sudden it's morning. Maybe he fell asleep. All of that was just a dream. He never met anybody. We don't know for sure if it even happened. So we have the reversal of good and evil. We have innocence being exposed to evil, but not really quite understanding what it's being exposed to. We have the ambiguity about who the good guys and bad guys are. We don't know if Faith joined or she didn't join. We don't know if young Goodman Brown joined or he didn't join. We don't even know if anybody joined. We don't know whether those people really are just Puritans and he's paranoid because he had this dream, or we don't know if he was right about them. And that all makes it, of course, look like a modern story, because you don't know, it's not simple good and evil like it is for the Romantics. We don't get inside the characters. There are always alternatives. The snake just seems like a snake. It might or might not be. We hear Deacon Gookin and the minister, but we don't actually see them. Goody Cloyce does turn around and say the devil, but we don't know if she was identifying him or not. Now, my interpretation of the story really turns on that section where they stop Goody Cloyce. The devil reaches out and touches her. "Ah, forsooth, and it is your worship indeed," cried the good dame. "Yes, truly it is, and in the very image of my old gossip, my old friend, Goodman Brown, the grandfather of that silly fellow that now is. But would your worship believe it, my broomstick hath strangely disappeared. Stolen, as I suspect, by that unhanged witch Goody Cory. And that too when I was all anointed with the juice of smallage and cinquefoil and wolfsbane." And that's the key. The conspiracy that young Goodman Brown may or may not imagine. When you first look at it, you think that's preposterous. How could there be witches everywhere? Actually, pretty simply. And it has to do with this description of flying ointment. All three of those plants are members of the aconite family of plants. They share characteristics with another member of the aconite family of plants, belladonna. Belladonna, also called deadly nightshade. It had a brief popularity in the 60s as a recreational drug. Its popularity was brief because if you take a tiny, tiny amount of belladonna, and many of you probably have, if you've taken a lot of the allergy medicines, a little bit of belladonna clears up your sinuses. A little bit more belladonna gives you hallucinations. Generally, the hallucinations were nightmarish in quality. But lots of people like to be scared. So they took them to have the live in Stephen King's mind for a little while. If you take just a little bit more belladonna, you stop breathing. And because you can never tell the strength of the street drugs. A lot of people overdose, and after that people said, well, never mind, we'll just take LSD and go to the Haunted Mansion if we want to get ourselves scared. Back when LSD was legal, which it was in the early 60s, Timothy Leary, the guru of LSD, was a psychiatrist at Harvard. And he gave people LSD to study it as a psychiatrist. And he found out two things about drugs and about hallucinations. One is they're determined by set and setting. Where you take them and what you expect go a long way to determining what kind of hallucinations you're going to have. If the people he gave LSD took it to under his care and had trust that he was going to be able to help them out with if they started going crazy from it, and they took it in a garden, they usually had these psychedelic 60s hallucinations. On the other hand, if you took it with a bunch of Hell's Angel bikers in a grave in a cemetery in New Orleans, the odds were you're going to have the nightmare vision. So what you get depends on where you take it and what you expect to happen. Now, this is flying ointment. That idea of the witches flying has some basis in fact. You remember how they dressed? They didn't. And they rubbed flying ointment on themselves. Now, there are a number of ways you can take drugs. You can eat them, you can inhale them, you can inject them, and you can apply them topically. So you rub flying ointment with belladonna in it on your body and run around the room, and what happens? The drug starts to take effect. Your setting is that you're with a bunch of other people also riding on broomsticks, which is also covered by flying ointment, and applying the drug to an area with a terrific blood supply. So it's getting into your system pretty quickly. And you expect that you're going to fly, so what's your hallucinations going to be? That you're flying. Now people nobody seems to really trust their reality. We're always checking our reality with other people. Maybe you ever said, is it hot in here or is it me? What? Your thermostat doesn't work? Why would you need somebody else to validate that for you? Well, that's how we judge the world. We do it by getting other people to validate it for us. And we'll take their opinion over our own. And one of the psychology experiments is, we take somebody who isn't here tonight, and we agree that when they come back next week, we're all going to go up to them one at a time and tell them how bad they look. And what will happen, and they come in and they're feeling great, and you go up and go, boy, you are right. You look sick. You sure you're okay? By the fifth person, say, I don't know, I felt good when I came in here, but I'm feeling pretty queasy right now. That's how much we use other people to validate our... So you're having these hallucinations, you think you're flying, and you say to the witches next to you, am I flying or hallucinating? And what do they say? Of course you're flying. Look, there's Farmer Brown's barn down there. And what happens when you look down there? You see it. You get what you expect to see. Now, how does that lead to the conspiracy? It leads to the conspiracy in this way. You notice that there are a number of ministers there. You'd think, well, that's the last place you'd find a minister. Not necessarily so. All you have to do is go to a Puritan minister and say, look, I got mixed up with these people, turned out they're witches, the devil is coming for my soul tonight, you got to save me. No Puritan minister would turn that down. The chance to confront their faith against Satan, they can't pass that up. So you take him along with you. And he's going into the woods, and the woods are the outskirts of hell as far as he's concerned. And then pretty soon there are these big fires, and there are people dancing around it naked. This is downtown hell now. But there's no devil there. So he says to you, well, where's Satan? Let's get this over. He says, I don't know. You know, he's usually so punctual. Something must have happened. I'll go and find out. Here, hold my broomstick. What happens? Now he's got it. And this is a guy who believes in the physical presence of evil in the world. His heart's beating 300 beats a minute. His hand is just flushed with blood. And then you wait. And when he starts looking around, because the mind insists on imposing patterns on ambiguous input, you simply go up and say, oh, saw the demons, did you? Immediately those shifting shadows coalesce into just what you told them they were. What happens to your suggestibility when you take drugs? Go up or down? Oh no. I'm sure you've heard of people who've taken drugs. Alcohol's a drug. What does that do to your suggestibility? Why do you think guys feed you drinks all night long? It increases your suggestibility. And the same thing there, so that after you've convinced them that the demons are everywhere, and you tell them the guy in the horned hat is Satan, what does he think? Must be. Is he telling me the truth? Oh yes, that's definitely Satan, isn't it? Yes, that's Satan. Yes, everybody here says that's him. Okay, must be then. Let's go join the coven. That's a good idea. Can we get like tattoos on our forehead too? No matter what you suggest, they're going to join. Now, if you get the minister, there are two ways that you validate this form. One is, any experience under drugs is radically different from any experience not under drugs. You've scrambled half your brain, so it's not going to feel the same. But he doesn't have the same explanation. Remember, they don't understand drugs. They see drugs as being the activity of certain psychoactive plants as being indwelling spirits. They don't think of it the way we think of it, as a physiological change of brain chemistry. So he's got no other explanation for this unusual experience except the supernatural one. And then you tell him that whatever he wants, his wish is going to come true. And the next day, when he's not in the forest, and he's not under the experience of drug, his wish comes true. He wants to get rich, he finds money. He wants his business to prosper, all of a sudden clients are banging at the door. He wants somebody gorgeous to fall in love with him, boom, there they are. Now how does that happen? You don't think it's because Satan runs the world, do you?
Yeah, she goes out and makes it, like he'll do something to improve his business, or, you know. He's
going to make some improvements, but you're not going to leave that to chance. You want to recruit him and keep him for good. You make it happen. There's a lot of people in the coven. There's a lot of interlocking covens. And there's a lot of money. You've got a lot of money because you've been taking collection too for a long, long time. Sex is part of the religion. If he wants a redhead, you just go to somebody in the covenant and go, look, we'd like you to go practice the religion with this new recruit. No problem. Nothing like better than practicing the old religion. So he gets his wish. Some of his customers are probably witches. You make sure that he gets more. You make it come true. Now, once you've got the minister, you've got everybody. Everybody in his congregation whose faith gets shaky goes to him and say, I don't know, I think I'm damned. Yes, you are, but come with me tonight and I'll show you an alternative. So you got everybody in his. And he gets the other ministers. He writes and says, I got witches in my parish. You got to come and help me out. So, okay, the other minister comes. We sneak up on the witches' meeting. Look, they're over there now. The devil's going to come soon. I'm going to sneak around. Here, hold my walking stick. And you wait till he hallucinates. You come back. You program his hallucinations. You got him. Now you've got his congregation as well. And this is where it gets scary. These things are secret. And I think what Hawthorne figured out in doing his research for this was, go back to the Salem witch trials. The only people who didn't get hanged or didn't get punished were people who admitted to being witches. How could that happen? So basically all believe Lee Harvey Oswald shot Kennedy too? It's a conspiracy. The witches ran the Salem witch trials. Grand-Uncle Jonathan wasn't just a war criminal who put innocent people to death, he was a witch. Who would have got a bigger laugh out of putting to death the godly Puritans for witchcraft than the witches? And the scariest part is that if he's right, and there was that conspiracy, did it go away? No. This is a church. There are churches that have been around in America for 250 years or more. And there are secret societies that flourished at least that well. The early Masons, for example, were still around. I know they seem pretty harmless now, but who knows whether they're still having... You know that most of the presidents of the country were Masons. Ben Franklin was a Mason, secret society. In any case, I think Hawthorne may have come to the conclusion that great-granduncle Jonathan was a witch, that there really was a conspiracy, and that the conspiracy was everywhere. And maybe he didn't want to stick around and say hello to his neighbors because he wasn't sure who was coming down that road, a witch or a non-witch. So I think young Goodman Brown is really a key to some of Hawthorne's paranoia, as well as a much more plausible story than it might have seemed on the surface of it. They may still be here, and they may still be running things. Actually, when you look around in the world, does good seem to be winning? Now, if you look at my kinsman Major Molyneux, although you won't find any witches in there, you will find the same basic structure that we had in young Goodman Brown. How are young Goodman Brown and Robin Molyneux alike? They're both young, they're both innocent, they both get exposed to evil step by step. The very first thing Hawthorne does is what he does pretty early on in young Goodman Brown. He turns good and evil upside down. Now, Hawthorne's day had a very idealized image of American history. The American patriots were practically on a holy crusade against the evils of tyranny. The British and British sympathizers were all the bad guys, and the American patriots were all the good guys. In this story, first thing he does is turn that upside down. He talks about the governors who had ruled New England. And after they gave back the charter, the king started appointing the governors. And he talks about how badly the governors were treated. The people looked with most jealous scrutiny to the exercise of power which did not emanate from themselves. And they usually rewarded their rulers with slender gratitude for the compliances by which, in softening their instructions from beyond the sea, they incurred the reprehension of those who gave them. In other words, he says, the governors weren't bad guys. They came here with harsh instructions. They didn't carry them out. They took it as easy on the colonists as they could. Because they took it easy on the colonists, the people who appointed them didn't support them. And the colonists didn't thank them for being easy on them because they felt they should have been electing their own governors. So instead of the governors, who were all Tories, who were all British sympathizers, who would normally be seen of as evil, they're not seen as evil. They're seen as, if anything, the victims. They were kind of middle managers. They had responsibility for everything and they had power over nothing. And so everybody turned on them. And they shot at them and they harassed them and they argued with them and they drove them all into an early grave. So right away he's taken the Tories and made them, if not the good guys, at least not the bad guys right away. Then he takes the American Revolution, which again, to people in Hawthorne's day was like a crusade. And he doesn't talk about the American Revolution as something wonderful. Instead, the reader, in order to avoid a long and dry detail of colonial affairs, is requested to dispense with an account of the train of circumstances that has caused much, now notice, not much outpouring of patriotic fervor, caused much temporary inflammation of the popular mind. The revolution was a fad. It was a brief period of insanity. Turns the revolution on its head. Major Molyneux works for the governor. So that makes him, normally, would he be a good guy or a bad guy? The governor's a bad guy. He's appointed by the crown. He'd be a bad guy too. Is he? No, you know, so we never see anything bad about him. In fact, you can't help feeling sorry for him because he's being tarred and feathered. You have to remember what being tarred and feathered mean. It doesn't just mean that they rub pitch on you. They heated it up and they tarred you. And that's like napalm. It burns down into the skin. Thank you. You're going to be burned over 80 or 90% of your body. The odds on surviving that today are not very good. In those days, it was a slow death sentence. So this is a guy who's being tortured to death. And yet, we never see him as villainous. If anything, he's admirable. His face was pale as death and far more ghastly. I'm sorry, let me go back a line. He was an elderly man, of large and majestic person. Notice he wasn't a cowardly-looking guy. He was majestic. And strong, square features betokening a steady soul. So he seems to be a good person as well. But steady as it was, his enemies had found the means to shake it. His face was pale as death and far more ghastly. The broad forehead was contracted in his agony so that his eyebrows formed one grizzled line, one gray line. His eyes were red and wild, and the foam hung white upon his quivering lip. His whole frame was agitated by a quick and continual tremor, which his pride strove to quell, even in those circumstances, not of just punishment of a traitor, those circumstances of overwhelming humiliation. But perhaps the bitterest pang of all were when his eyes met those of Robin. For evidently he knew him on the instant, as the youth stood witnessing, not the punishment of a Tory, not justice being delivered to an enemy of America, but as the youth stood witnessing the foul disgrace of a head grown gray in honor. So here we have an old guy who's being tortured, and he's still so tough he won't give in and give them the satisfaction of breaking down. And the only real humiliation is that his nephew, or whatever relation Robin is, gets to see him. So he's an admirable person. When they go marching off, you can't help but sympathize with them. On they went like fiends that throng in mockery. You notice, like devils. The throng in mockery around some dead potentate, mighty no more, but majestic still in his agony. On they went in counterfeit pomp, in senseless uproar, in frenzied merriment, trampling all on an old man's heart. How can you not root for Major Molyneux? So here's the Tory that we ought to be against, turns out to be a good guy. Well, how about the people who tortured him? Who are they? They're dressed like Indians. When were Americans dressed like Indians? Boston Tea Party. These are the patriots. These are the people who are normally the heroes. And instead we see them as the villains. In fact, the guy who leads them, another character that's similar to young Goodman Brown. Robin comes in, and like young Goodman Brown, he's gradually introduced to evil. First guy he meets is the ferryman. Now the ferryman isn't good or bad. He's in between because he doesn't live in the town. Remember, for Romanticism, the town is corrupt, sophisticated, evil. The countryside, nature, and good. Robin's from the country. He's good. The ferryman's in between both worlds. He's not completely good. Robin promised them a tip to bring him across. And when Robin starts fumbling for money, puts the lantern up to get a good look at him, because he's no innocent. He's been stiffed for his fare before. Goes into town, and the first guy he meets is the one that has that in the middle of it, who turns out to be the mayor. When the procession comes by, he comes out of the biggest house in town. You notice that whenever Robin meets people, they have one of two reactions to him. Either they laugh at him, or they threaten him. And it depends on what they think he is. They all know that Major Molyneux is going to be tarred and feathered tonight, because they're all patriots. The ones that laugh at him think he's making a joke. They're going to tar and feather this guy, and you come in and say, "Have you seen my kinsman, Major Molyneux?" They're thinking, nobody would admit to that. It's got to be a joke. They're laughing. Or they're laughing because they're thinking it's a joke. No, not as much as we're going to see of him tonight when we strip him naked and tar and feather him. Or they think that he's an agent provocateur. The British know something's going on. They know it's got something to do with Major Molyneux. So how do you find out? You want to root out the terrorists? You infiltrate them with an agent provocateur. He says, "Hey, I got dynamite. Let's go blow this place up." They say yes, and then you just wait for them to show up, and then you arrest them. Well, it's the same thing. You send somebody around to ask for Major Molyneux, hoping somebody will go, "Well, we'll see him tonight when we tar and feather him." What was your name again? So they're afraid he's an agent provocateur. That's why they're hostile to him. They think he's there to trap them, and their opinions vary. Everybody he meets is more and more corrupt. That's why the mayor is so upset with him, because the mayor is elected by Americans. So he's got to be a patriot. But he's got to work with the governor, and he serves at the pleasure of the governor, so he's got to please the British. So no matter how he answers that question, he's putting himself in danger. When Robin says, "Have you seen my kinsman Major Molyneux?" if he says, "Not as much as we'll see of him tonight," and it turns out Robin's from the British side, the governor's going to fire him as mayor. On the other hand, if he plays dumb and says, "Who's this Major Molyneux guy?" and it turns out Robin's a patriot, then he's afraid they'll go, "Well, the mayor doesn't know about this? We don't trust the mayor? The mayor's one of them." He'll end up being tarred and feathered. So he's got the most to lose. That's also why he laughs so loud when he comes out, and now Robin's been put on the spot, just the way Robin's been putting everybody else on the spot. The night watchman is the next one we see. Is he what he's supposed to be? Does he carry out his duties thoroughly? No, he threatens Robin, "Better get off the street or we'll have you in the stocks by tomorrow morning," and goes right around the corner. Just ignores him. How about the young lady that he meets? It says that she's Major Molyneux's housekeeper. Is she? No, it's a seedy part of town. Her petticoats are scarlet. She answered, "What are petticoats?" They're underwear. They're like slips. Did ladies then answer the door in their slip? Were they hanging out in their slips, looking out the door for good-looking guys to go by? Who would be doing this? Prostitute. She's trying to lure him inside. That's why finally, when she leans out of the window, Robin, the son of the minister, goes, "Oh, this is one of those wicked city women my father warned me about." And he leaves. And of course, she's trying to invite him in, but as soon as she hears somebody coming, she shuts the door and runs away. Doesn't come back. She thinks it's the watch. She doesn't want to get arrested. So she's corrupt. Again, he keeps meeting, the more he's in town, the more corruption he meets. And when he goes to the inn, which is really after the night watch, the innkeeper seems to be treating him nicely. Why is he treating him so nice? He wants him to spend money. It's professional, you know, come again, have a nice day. They don't really mean that. I hope this isn't disillusioning anybody. It's professional courtesy. But Robin's naive. He doesn't know that. He thinks, oh, they recognize how much I look like Major Molyneux, so they're trying to be nice to me. As soon as he mentions Major Molyneux, the innkeeper starts reading off the wanted poster. Hezekiah Mudge, escaped bound and servant. He's going to have Robin put in jail for 2 or 3 weeks till somebody shows up and goes, that doesn't even look like Hezekiah Mudge. Why did you even imprison him? Because Robin has no money to spend. So that's about as corrupt as it gets. But the real corrupt figure is the one who's standing off to the side with a group of ill-dressed associates. His features were separately striking, almost to grotesqueness. The whole face left a deep impression on the memory. The forehead bulged out in a double prominence. With a veil, a valley between. The nose came boldly forth in an irregular curve, and its bridge was of more than a finger's breadth. The eyebrows were deep and shaggy, and the eyes glowed beneath them like fires in a cave. Who is this? The devil, same one we saw in the last story. And every time we see him, he's described as a devil. The next time, he's got one side of the face was blazed an intense red, while the other was black as midnight, the division line being in the broad bridge of the nose. And the mouth, which seemed to extend from ear to ear, was black or red in contrast to the other cheek. The effect was as if 2 individual devils, a fiend of fire and a fiend of darkness, had united themselves to form this infernal visage. And I think the third time we see him, where do we see him the third time we see this guy with the red and black face? Leading the procession, it's tarring and feathering Major Molyneux. The devil is at the head of these people. Are they the good guys? No. In fact, when he confronts the devil, he's on church ground. He stopped in front of that church in the doorway, and the guy comes by. That's when we first see him with the face half red and half black. Robin stops him and demands to know where Major Molyneux is. Now, one of the names for the devil is the father of lies. So even when he tells you the truth, he's lying to you. He says to Robin, stay here a while, and he'll see him. How will he see him? Passing by, being tarred and feathered. This leads us to the Faith-like character. Remember, we didn't know whether Faith was good or bad? Robin stops another guy, but he's described as being intelligent and friendly and nice to Robin. And he says, is there anything I can help you with? And Robin says, well, I want to find my kinsman, Major Molyneux. The guy says, oh yeah, I know that name. So at first you think he's going to help Robin. But the answer he gives him is the same as the devil. Stay here a while and you'll see him. Now, is there any reason why a good guy wouldn't tell Robin, yes, they're tarring and feathering your uncle, that's what all that noise is you hear? What will Robin do if you tell him that? Go and try and stop it and get himself tarred and feathered. So the guy might be a good guy. He may be trying to help Robin. If he sits Robin there, they come along. If Robin starts to try to stop it, maybe he can stop Robin. So maybe he is a good guy. But we don't know. Because he gives the same answer that the devil gave. So that makes him ambiguous. Then we have the same problem with Robin that we had with young Goodman Brown. And that is, when they show up, everybody's laughing. First, everybody's laughing at Robin because he's confronted with this problem of his ancestor. But then, the contagion was spreading among the multitude when all at once it seized upon Robin. He set forth a shout of laughter that echoed through the streets. Every man shook his sides, every man emptied his lungs. But Robin's shout was the loudest there. Why does Robin laugh? If he doesn't want to be seen as the stranger and doesn't want to get tarred and feathered, what does that mean about his innocence? It's gone. He's sold out. To save himself, he joins the bad guys. But he may be laughing because he's horrified. Remember, when your emotions get really intense, they slide into their opposite easily. So it may be that he's so appalled at being faced with evil that he laughs. But we don't know. We not only don't know why Robin laughs, we don't know whether or not any of this even happened. Because what did Robin do when he sat down on the church steps? He fell asleep. He had that dream. He's fading in and out of the dream of his parents and his family back home. And when we first see the procession, it's described as if a dream had escaped from a feverish brain. And what really throws it all into question is the narrator even becomes ambiguous. His description of the procession marching off. The cloud spirits peeped from their silvery islands as the congregated mirth went roaring up the sky. The man in the moon heard the far bellow. "Ho, ho," quoth he, "the old earth is frolicsome tonight." Cloud spirits? The man in the moon talking? Is this a trustworthy scientific observer? No, this guy is as involved in the fantasy of the situation as everybody else. We can't even trust the narrator. So we get to the end of the story, we don't know the last part of it. Robin says, "Show me the way to go, to leave town." When he was introduced, Robin said to the guy, "I'm a shrewd youth." Well, shrewd means tricky. Of course, which shows he isn't very tricky. Not many tricky people go, "I'm tricky, watch out for me." So, but it does show that he's willing to become corrupted. And he says, "Show me the way out of town." The guy says, "No, in a few days. Stay, and because you are a shrewd youth, you may rise in the world without Major Molyneux." Does he leave or not?
We don't know.
We don't know. We don't know any more than we knew if young Goodman Brown joined. We don't know who the good guys are. We don't know the bad guys. We don't know if it happened. We don't know what any of it meant. It's ambiguous. It has all of those characteristics of the modern short story.